All right, friends, please open up your texts to page 185. This is the Griffiths article. Okay, and the module that we're doing is how to be a successful Christian and a successful business person. Yes. 185. 185. Okay, how to be a successful Christian and a successful business person. And in the context of that, I want to do a little sub-module today on being a moral business person in a global context. Okay, so we're going to talk about the issues some of the issues surrounding globalization, and we're going to do a little mini module on that for about a week here. And in the context of that, the general questions we're thinking about are how to be a successful Christian, morally speaking, and also how to be a financially successful business person. Okay, so if you'll open up the Griffiths article, Griffiths is talking about a lot of the forces of globalization that have accelerated in the last several decades. Globalization means lots of different things. It certainly means better communications. It certainly means closer technologies that bring us closer together. It also, though, generally speaking, means outsourcing, which means suppliers that used to be stateside are now located in developing world countries, often many thousands of miles away. Okay, now I know that the recent administration, the Trump administration, rolled back a whole bunch of the free trade agreements that this country had. There is a fight that's continuing to go on at a national level between the pro-free trade people and the anti-free trade people. The current administration, the Biden administration, is generally much more positive towards free trade than the Trump administration was. But globalization has meant that because of low tariffs or no tariffs, over the last several decades, that has been the trend towards lower or no tariffs. Globalization has meant that suppliers are now much more frequently in developing world countries than they are in the United States. And so when MNCs, or multinational companies, that are domiciled in the United States outsource their supply chain to the developing world, which is the standard MO these days, it raises certain interesting and difficult ethical questions. So in the Griffiths article, let's look at some of the criticisms of globalization. Okay, on page 188, I'll just read this in the second column. The more common criticisms made of globalization are the following. The rules of the game governing globalization are biased towards the rich countries and against poor countries. It has undermined democracy in developing countries because it has compromised their sovereignty in key areas. It is facilitating an apparent environmental crisis. More on that a little bit later. It is not a win-win situation, as the process creates losers in developed as well as developing countries. It has forced governments of developing countries to implement policies such as privatization, liberalization, and the removal of capital controls which have been inappropriate and damaging, etc., etc. Okay, so in the context of globalization, it might be useful to think of this process as having both winners and losers. In terms of demographic groups that do better as a result of closer communications, technologies that have brought the world closer together, supply chains that are outsourced, Western values being spread around the world, it might be useful to think of this process in terms of some demographics that happen to be winners and other demographic groups that happen to be losers. Okay, so I'll just start us off with a demographic group that is basically a runaway winner from the globalization process, and that is American consumers, first world consumers. They get their products much, much cheaper than they otherwise would as a result of globalization processes, including especially the supply chain outsourcing. So Walmart is functionally, I guess you might say, the Chinese embassy in America. All of their stuff gets made over in China for a fraction of the price that they could make it here, and as a result of low tariffs, no tariffs, although, like I said, there was some protectionism coming out of this past administration. American consumers pay much, much less than they would have to do if all these products were being made stateside. Okay, so that gets us started with one demographic group that is a winner group. Okay? Let's think a little bit about other winners and losers. Put your head to it for just a second. Based on your reading of the Griffiths article, based on what I've said so far about what makes up globalization, the greater integration, the spreading of Western values, the outsourcing, all these characteristics of these processes. Who are some other winner and loser demographic groups? Let's try for a loser demographic group. What is an example of a demographic group that has not benefited from globalization?
Probably a third world country that's producing all these goods.
Okay.
Just getting little in return, I guess.
Good. Okay, good. Yeah, so it all depends on who you are, right? And it could be argued that certain developing world countries don't necessarily make off very well from the globalization process. Okay, with a caveat, it depends on who you are in the developing world country. Okay, if you're a local government official who's receiving major bribes from an MNC, you're obviously doing very well as a result of globalization processes. Okay, but some kinds of people, let's say ordinary third world workers. Now this is controversial because some people say they're actually better off than they would otherwise be. Okay, so I'm just going to list them though here, and we'll talk about why and think through this situation. Okay, developing world workers. Let's take your average Chinese laborer. Okay, this is someone who has journeyed to, should I try to draw a map of China and embarrass myself? All right, there we go. This is China. Okay, and here's Hong Kong and Hainan down here. Okay, Beijing, Shanghai. All right, your average Chinese laborer has journeyed to the city of Shenzhen, which is a booming, bustling, capitalist-style city in South China near Hong Kong. It's on the other side of the border with Hong Kong. Okay, and in Shenzhen, she works in an electronics factory where she assembles smartphones for a Western manufacturer. Okay, she has journeyed to Shenzhen from her farm near, let's say it's near Xi'an, which is in central China. Okay, where her family continues to live. All right, now in Shenzhen, she is in dorm-style living facilities. This is very common. Okay, the hours are long, the pay is low. She shares communal bathrooms, right? She doesn't get a whole lot out of this arrangement. And yet, she stays. Okay, it is not coerced most of the time. Okay, yes, they have barbed wire fences. Yes, they do have patrolling dogs. Apple had to install suicide nets, okay, because so many people were jumping bad working conditions in the factories. However, most of the time, this is not explicitly coerced. Okay, it's not physically coerced. So she stays in Shenzhen. Why does she stay? All right, she's moved from her family farm in Xi'an down to Shenzhen. Why does she stay? She needs the money. It's better than her alternatives? Okay, let's think about what her alternatives are. 2 generations ago, what did her grandparents do?
Rice.
They were rice farmers, okay? Or soybean farmers or something similar. Okay, they were subsistence level farmers. A subsistence level farmer is someone who just farms as much as he or she needs to survive, to get along. Okay, and a couple generations ago, all her ancestors were subsistence level farmers. Okay, why can she not now continue to be a subsistence level farmer? Why is this not possible for her now? Why did she go to Shenzhen?
It's not enough.
She can't make it anymore as a subsistence farmer. That's correct. She cannot make it anymore. Why can't she make it anymore?
Competition.
Her rice no longer fetches the same price at the market as it once did. Okay, because industrial farming has now reduced the costs of food production to the point where subsistence level farmers can no longer make a living as subsistence level farmers. Maybe the grandparents can continue to get by, but they certainly don't want this for their children. They can see it's a dead end, and quite frankly, their standard of living has been declining for a number of years as a result of the fact that their rice and their soybeans don't fetch as much at the market price as they used to. Okay, so she moves to Shenzhen, where she now works in a factory under mediocre conditions. Not necessarily great, but not necessarily terrible. The number of sweatshops these days, because of sweatshop reform in the 90s and early 2000s, has actually declined, so that's a good thing. But by American standards, American working standards, her work conditions are terrible. They're really bad. She's getting often lung problems. She's often getting very little in terms of compensation, like compensation levels that American workers would be horrified by. Guatemalan and Honduran garment workers regularly pull in 7 to 11 cents an hour. Okay, now I know that the cost of living there is much lower. The cost of living index is much lower in the developing world than it is here in the United States. But even if you adjust for the cost of living, we're still looking at wages that are probably around 65 to 70 cents an hour. Much less than American workers make, right? What's our minimum wage here in Texas? $7.25. That's probably going to be going up, probably in the near future, maybe under federal pressure. Okay. Is she a winner or is she a loser from globalization?
So she's a loser.
I think she's a loser too. I think she's a loser too on balance. I think she would have a better life and a better standard of living if globalization had not occurred. Okay, it has separated her from her family structure. She is by herself in the city. It has reduced her ability to save. It has done a lot of things that are damaging to her. However, there are things to be said on behalf of globalization in terms of the prosperity that she and her descendants can look forward to. Okay, so globalization brings all sorts of connections across the network of the world. And that means that businesses that previously might have had no interest in investing important capital to build infrastructure in Guangdong or other parts of the province down here near Shenzhen are now interested in doing so, and they have business connections, and over the coming decades they will increasingly turn to that area of the world to try to make their products more cheaply and to try to build out construction processes in their supply chain in a manner that will ultimately contribute to the overall economic welfare of that area of China. Okay, so although she might not directly benefit, and although her standard of living has declined comparatively to what it once was a couple generations ago, still her country as a whole might benefit, and her surroundings might benefit because of increased economic activity, increased capital coming in and building out the infrastructure. Okay, I should add to the losers, I'm going to put another winner group over here in a minute, but I should add to the losers those who are advocates of local culture. Okay, because local cultures around the world are destroyed when Western style financing, Western style supply chains come in and build those factories, and the local peoples no longer have their own cultural products. Okay, so just like the Walmart phenomenon destroyed mom and pop stores, so also the globalization phenomenon destroys local culture. At the same time, however, developing world countries as a whole do make it out. It does get better for them as a result of globalization. Okay? So although ordinary developing world workers in the moment might not be winners, developing countries are winners on balance. Case in point. Okay? This is happening as we speak in China, but it has already happened in Japan. In the 1960s, 1950s, 1960s, following the horrors of World War II, Japan rebuilt their country, building supply chain products, mostly little cheap tchotchkes and other kinds of, gadgets for Western countries. But over time, they learned and built out through that infrastructure building process educational support, and ultimately began building much more substantive industrial things. Okay, and now, obviously, they are the world's leading auto manufacturer. They are the world's leading manufacturer of a bunch of different electronics. Okay, they are an enormous success story in the globalization game. Okay, so over time, that's just one example. I could cite a bunch of examples. Over time, prosperity does increase in developing countries as a result of the closer economic connections, as a result of the tighter, more tightly knit network, the supply chain outsourcing, all of the know-how that is acquired educationally as a result of globalization. It just doesn't necessarily help the ordinary developing world worker in the moment right now. In fact, she's probably worse off in the moment right now than she otherwise would be. Let me pause and ask if there are comments or questions so far. Let me list one other loser group and then also a winner group. Okay, so actually first a winner group. MNCs are big winners from this. MNCs, multinational companies, their profit margins are substantially increased by virtue of globalization processes. Okay, we're going to look at a case study, Apple, in a minute. Apple makes about 45 to 50 cents on the dollar for every iPhone that they sell. Okay, that's incredible margins, unreal. They would not be able to sustain that without a very cheap supply chain. MNCs make off very well from this arrangement. Okay, one other loser group though, and this might take a little bit of thinking to wrap our minds around, but it's actually true. Okay, one other loser group is workers in Western countries, first world countries, developed countries, who have skill sets that their country does not have a comparative advantage in. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about comparative advantage and how that is driving this, maybe a little bit later this week. But I'm talking about workers in the United States or in European countries who do things that are now done as a result of globalization in developing countries. Okay, workers in America with the supply chain skills. Okay, so this means steel workers in Pittsburgh. This means miners in West Virginia. This means auto workers in Detroit. American workers whose jobs are now done overseas as a result of cheap supply chains driving outsourcing. When somebody in Malaysia can do it more cheaply than someone in Detroit, the company execs that are running these MNCs will find a way to get the product done in Malaysia. Okay, when somebody in Pittsburgh has a skill set that no longer makes him money in his first world country, he loses his job and he becomes, as a result of the globalization process, worse off in terms of his personal prosperity. This last election cycle, in 2016, not 2020, in 2016, the major demographic group that elected Trump as president was disgruntled workers from industrial belt states in the United States who lost their jobs or saw declining incomes as a result of their jobs going overseas due to globalization processes. Okay, they were like the core demographic that drove the Trump presidency. Okay, next to the evangelicals who kind of made a sort of a bargain with Trump, who was not one of them, but they made a bargain with him as someone who would be their standard bearer at any rate. That's a different story. But okay, so workers in America with supply chain skills end up being losers in the globalization process. Recently, Joe Biden was asked at a press conference, what about those kinds of workers? Do you stand for them? What about the jobs that they have lost? And his response was, they need to learn to code, which means they need to learn new skills, basically, he was saying. Now, it's kind of hard to tell a 53-year-old who's lost his job, you need to learn to code. That sounds pretty rough, honestly. That's a pretty insensitive remark, but it is the attitude that a lot of advocates of globalization do hold. Okay, let me pause and ask if there are comments or questions or reflections so far before we talk about the ethics of these processes. Yes?
Overall, you think the ethics of the losers is more than the winners?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is this a good thing? Yeah, so I'm gonna say there are definitely really bad things coming about as a result of globalization. There are also really good things coming about as a result of it. Like any major force going on in the world of business, it has upsides and downsides. And I'm going to say to the extent that globalization angles toward the good, it is good. But all too often it does angle towards the bad and ends up actually harming the people that it is supposed to help in theory. Yeah, so that would be my response, yeah. Good. Other questions or comments? We'll talk about the specifics of how that goes down in a minute. Questions or comments, reflections on the ethics of this? Okay, so whether you or not you're benefiting from globalization all depends on who you are. If you're one of the workers whose skill sets is now outsourced from America, I mean, tough, right? By the way, America has actually taken steps to ensure that certain kinds of workers don't lose their jobs overseas. So for instance, America's farmers get heavy subsidies from the US federal government every year, like hundreds of billions in subsidies actually. Why do we pay farmers so much in America above and beyond what their crops would actually fetch at the market? Does anybody have a theory as to why we might do that? Their food could be grown more cheaply in Bolivia or in Malaysia or in Indonesia, and it could then just be shipped here.
Is there higher tariffs on food than like actual other products?
We do often place higher tariffs on food than on other products, that is right. But we also, above and beyond just the tariffs, we actively subsidize farmers. Why would we do that if their food could be grown more cheaply elsewhere? Oh, come on. Someone's got a theory, right? National security reasons is the answer. If you ever get into a wartime situation and your food is all outsourced, that's a problem, right? So, and it takes like years to build up an infrastructure of food production. So you can't just flip a switch and have food, farmers growing their soybeans and their corn and stuff in 6 months. So in order to maintain a continuing line of food production within the country, we actually actively subsidize farmers in ways that are economically inefficient, but that make sense for other reasons. Okay? All right. Those are an example. That's an example of workers in America who have supply chain skills that for things that could be done more cheaply elsewhere. Okay, let's talk about the ethics of all this. All right, if you turn the page to the next article here, and again, I'm sorry we're a little bit far behind. We're kind of doing last week's stuff, but I wanted to get to this before the exam this week. Look at the Weidick article. Weidick is attempting to consider the processes of globalization from a Christian perspective. Okay, he says here on page 199, first column, I would like to consider economic globalization from the standpoint of three major principles that run throughout the scriptures, the objective being to help us as Christians to think more clearly and critically about globalization and to consider our roles in the midst of it. The first biblical principle is that God clearly cares about the poor and about the response of the rich to the poor among them. Let me just stop there. That's something I've emphasized in this class before. If you just take a cursory look at the Christian scriptures, it is clear that concern for the poor is central to God's heart. So if the MNCs, the yo-yo execs who are counting the beans, and they say, if we just squeeze those workers at that cheapo little factory in Indonesia a bit harder, they're really weak. We have asymmetric bargaining power with them. Maybe pay the local regulators in Indonesia certain bribe fees, or like it's hard to find real bribes, so they'll pay a speaking fee or something like that, so that they'll overlook the way we're treating these workers. Then we can increase our margins, right? And that's more money for us. Okay, when they think like that, that's an aspect of globalization that pretty clearly seems to be in contradiction to biblical principles in terms of concern and care for the poor. Much more consistent with biblical principles is an approach to supply chain management where you negotiate, reasonably, but not as hard as you possibly could to destroy the asymmetrically weaker, worker group on the other side or something like that. Where you do basically what I've talked about with Starbucks, where they offer fair trade coffee arrangements with their developing world farmers. Okay, quite frankly, MNCs have so much power and workers in Honduras have so little power, it's really asymmetric. Since the MNCs could go anywhere in the world to find a cheaper manufacturer of their apparel, they find, capitalism finds the cheapest possible way to make the good. That's what happens. And as Christians operating in a capitalist system, there are plenty of opportunities to make profits through a globalization system, a system of supply chain management that is outsourced. But it doesn't mean that you always have to maximize your margins to the utmost extent, just for what it's worth. Okay, the second biblical principle is that interdependence between people is a community ideal. Okay, so that suggests that forces of globalization are a good thing. And then the third biblical principle is that God is not a patriot. In fact, Weidick wants to go on to argue that if we are opposed to globalization on nationalist grounds, he thinks that that's not consistent with biblical views of things. I'm not sure I agree with him on that. We can talk about that. But if you turn the page now, we'll talk about what's driving all this and the ethics of it. On page 200, we have here a discussion in the Weidick article of comparative advantage. Now, I think most of us who have taken World of Business and other similar, fundamental level classes have an awareness of comparative advantage. Yes? No? Just give me a little bit of feedback, people. Okay. All right. I'll explain it then, okay? Because I don't think there's a lot of awareness here. What is driving all this is something called comparative advantage. Okay, apologies, I'm going to have to keep a tight board, so we're just going to come back here and do this little diagram here. Okay, so, Kristen, I'll use you as an example, okay? So, Kristen and Dr. Neal, two workers going head to head, okay? Let's say we're going head to head at lawn mowing and at computer programming. Okay, LM for lawn mowing, CP for computer programming. Okay, and Kristen can make, oh, I didn't set this up right. Oh well, let's just forget about the little graphic that I just drew. Erase that from your notes. I'll set it up a different way. Okay, all right, so Kristen at lawn mowing is, you know, she's a decent lawn mower. $22 an hour. That's what she can do mowing lawns. Okay, did anybody mow lawns in high school? You did? Okay. I did too. I mowed lawns in high school. I could probably make a little bit more than 22 an hour. But the inflation forces that have gripped a bunch of jobs don't seem to have gripped lawn mowing as much. But I don't know. We'll see. As a computer programmer, we'll say she can make 30 an hour. Okay. Now, Dr. Neal is actually, for the sake of the example, let's say she's not very good at computer programming and makes 18 an hour. Okay. All right, Dr. Neal is a better lawnmower than Kristen is. Having had experience in high school many years ago, he can mow for 35 an hour. He also can program computers to the tune of 80 an hour. That's not true. That's a lie. Okay. I have mad Excel spreadsheet skills, though. Okay. That's the extent of it. All right. So what should Kristen do? Mow lawns, right?
Yeah.
She should mow lawns, okay? Even though Dr. Neal can mow lawns more efficiently than Kristen, he should program computers. Because he has a comparative advantage in computer programming, and that comparative advantage idea is relative to the other opportunities that you have, what is your advantage? Okay, relative to the other opportunities, that's the comparative part. So relative to the other opportunities that you have, what is your advantage? And if you do what you have an advantage in other words, you are doing what you could make the most at, then theoretically the society is functioning as efficiently as it possibly could. Okay, the society functions most efficiently when everybody does what he or she has a comparative advantage in.
What's the difference between absolute advantage?
Sure. Yeah, I have an absolute advantage over Kristen in both of these skill sets. Because I am more, let's say the dollar amount stands for efficiency, I'm a more efficient lawnmower. But she has a comparative advantage over me in mowing lawns. Workers in Honduras who are making garments have a comparative advantage over you when it comes to garment making. You may actually be a better garment maker than they are. But you are about to get a degree from an American university which will give you other job opportunities and give you basically this kind of a skill set so that it makes sense for you to do something else than apparel manufacturing. They don't have those opportunities. They don't have other skills, so they make the clothes or assemble the electronics engine. Okay, so comparative advantage is what is driving all of this. Comparative advantage is driving globalization. And comparative advantage means that those people who have no other skills outside of subsistence level farming, which no longer works for them, now are relegated to assembly line jobs in poor factory conditions with minimal kinds of wages, because that's what they have a comparative advantage in. And the society, speaking globally, the global society runs most efficiently when each individual component of it does what that individual component has a comparative advantage in. So that's what's driving all this. Okay, now we're going to look at the ethics in just a second, but are there questions or comments about that? Does everybody kind of understand comparative advantage? All right, now Weidich says on page 201, at the bottom of the first column, the winners in the typical pattern of today's economic globalization include consumers in both rich and poor countries and workers who possess skills that are associated with the country's actual or potential exports. The losers in the typical pattern of today's economic globalization essentially consist of one group, workers who possess skills that are associated with the country's actual or potential imports. Those are the steel makers, the coal miners, the farmers in Iowa. And Weidich goes on to argue the pain of the relatively small group of losers from trade is more sharply felt than the gain of the larger number of winners. As a result, the voice of the losers is disproportionately factored into the formulation of trade policy. Okay, Weidich is a fan of globalization, and he thinks that what's going on when critics argue that this harms certain demographic groups is those critics are not being sensitive to the ways in which globalization is helping other people. And quite frankly, I think he would say, although he doesn't say this here, I think he would say, look, I mean, if you've got a job that no longer works in your country because your country doesn't have a comparative advantage in that job, you need to find a new career. I think that would be what he would say. So the learn to code answer. But he says this crazy, incredible thing at the bottom of page 201. As such, Buy America campaigns are inconsistent with the biblical view of justice. On the contrary, because workers in other countries are poorer than even the poorest of our displaced workers, we should welcome new opportunities that arise for workers in the developing countries while supporting a strong social safety net and generous retraining and educational programs for our own displaced workers at home. Buy America campaigns are inconsistent with the biblical view of justice. He's basically saying, look, if you look at the poverty of people in the Third Ward in Houston and you compare it to the poverty of people in Johannesburg in South Africa, the impoverished people in the Third Ward are not nearly as impoverished as the people living in Johannesburg. And as such, when you give money and think about allocating your supply chain decisions, you should try to benefit economically those who are most impoverished in the world. That's what he's saying. Okay, I'm not sure I agree with that. I'm not sure if you should always give globally rather than locally when it comes to allocating economic opportunities or your profits or those sorts of things. But it is an opinion that I respect. Okay, questions or comments about that before we look at a case study? Thanks for your attention. I'm moving quickly today. We're going to look at a company we are all very familiar with, I think.